Welcome back to the Code Ryan podcast. Today, Jerome joins me and we're going to discuss Next.js as well as kind of his development journey so far and some different things that he's learned building a recent application for Free Code Camp using Next.js and some different tools there. But before we kind of get into that side of things, Jerome, could you maybe just give me some of your background on kind of your tech career so far? I know you're pretty new to this whole thing, but just a bit of kind of background here.
Cool. Yeah. So first thing, Ryan, thank you so much for having me on here. I'm 21 now. I started programming maybe since I was 15 years old. So just been doing that for a long time. I got into it because I wanted to build a website myself. You had the startup idea, you want to go build this stuff, etc. So I learned HTML, CSS, JavaScript. But then I ended up meeting a lead software engineer. And then it went from he decided to help me with it. So it went from basic HTML, CSS, JavaScript to Angular and trying to figure out how to do things in the back end with microservices and Docker and middleware. Complexity went crazy. So I did that for 2 years. And then I was going to school on and off. But the past year, I've just been self-studying a whole bunch of computer science topics. So everything from cryptography to discrete math to you name it. It's been a lot. Put it that way. Yeah.
Is there a certain area you're kind of looking to go in kind of the software engineering space? Is it kind of cryptography and that side of things, or where are you kind of looking to go in the future with it?
It's really, I like full stack web development. That's by far my favorite. I was looking at a whole bunch of Web3 stuff because I was super interested for a while. So I was looking at how the Ethereum virtual machine works and how smart contracts work, all this stuff works. So it's been a really interesting year, I can say. I'll say that.
Yeah, for sure. I think in kind of the software engineering space, there's always kind of new stuff and different routes to go down. And sometimes the hardest thing is deciding on one area and just focusing on that to learn it really well and then kind of stepping out from there. But awesome. So you recently created a course on Free Code Camp, a really good course that I definitely recommend the viewers to go check out, in which you use Next.js, TypeScript, as well as Tailwind to build kind of a YouTube clone. So kind of with that, were there particular reasons that you chose that tech stack in particular? Was it just a tech stack you were familiar with, or maybe why'd you kind of decide to go that route?
Great question. Okay, so I want to talk about what was my motivation for building it in the first place, and then I'll talk, and that'll be related to why I chose the tech stack. So, I'm trying to actually break into the industry. So the way I thought about doing that was actually just create a course online, just demonstrating the skills that I have. So if a recruiter wanted to go check it out, hey, look, I have all the code to how YouTube kind of works, just go check it out. So that was my thinking of it. But at the beginning, I didn't really know what were the industry technologies that was being used. So before I knew about HTML, CSS, JavaScript, one of the things was I knew I had a problem with CSS. So I was looking at what are all the different ways of writing CSS that are industry standard. So that led me to things like Sass, things of Tailwind. They had Material UI was another thing that came up. And Theo, the guy who actually created the T3 stack, he has a really good video explaining the different ways of actually writing all the different types of CSS. I really highly recommend it. So I landed on Tailwind. Okay, then the next one was I need to learn some sort of web framework. I've used Angular in the past, and I don't really recommend. Angular. Yeah, well, okay. React was the most popular. Maybe Svelte is better than React. I don't know, but it made sense for me to use React. But then you run into a problem of how do you do routing? How do you do things such as writing your middleware? How do you do these types of questions? So then it led me to Next.js, and I knew Next had good things with when it comes to server-side rendering and stuff when it comes to SEO purposes. So led me to Next, and also they had things that you can write with serverless functions. So it just made me gravitate towards Next. Then there's Next auth. So do you have your authentication, right? If you're using Next, you might as well use Next auth. And then when I was writing the backend back in high school, I remember the whole model view controller thing, right? So with your models, you have to directly map it directly. Your models is supposed to be a direct representation of what's actually happening in a database. So I was looking at what were the best models, and then you end up coming up with Prisma. That seemed to be like industry standard. And then database, MongoDB is okay. I've heard a lot about it, but I wanted to use a relational database because that's what I used back a couple of years ago. So I said MySQL sounds like to be the best. So I know there's a lot there, but this is sort of like my thinking. I just trying to figure out what are the industry standard stuff. So
yeah, I think that's a perfectly reasonable approach to go about it. And one question I do have is like, were all these, how much of these technologies were like completely new to you? Or did you already have a good understanding of like Next.js or Tailwind or some of these different things kind of heading into this? Because I can imagine if you didn't have any experience with any of this stuff, this would be a pretty kind of challenging thing to tackle. So what was kind of your experience ahead of time going into this?
Great question. So I had very little experience with any of this stuff before. One good, the best way to like actually learn something is actually to try to go and build it. So that's sort of like what I tried. I have experience with HTML, CSS, JavaScript, right? Like I've built like small things before, but nothing like as big as a YouTube clone before. So so very little experience with it.
So how was it like try to just dive straight into things, or how did you kind of go about learning Next.js? Did you just kind of use the documentation that they have, or what was kind of your process for, kind of building those skills live, kind of jumping into things? And I totally agree. I think when I was kind of first learning things, the best way for me to learn was literally just building projects and just kind of figuring it out as I go, as you can watch all these tutorials, but if you don't actually try to do it, I don't think that you learn it nearly as well. So what was kind of your process for learning Next.js and some of these tools that were new to you?
Great question. So I just want to highlight something real quick. So let's just say that you're trying to learn this stuff, right? Let's say HTML, CSS, JavaScript. You learn, okay, then you have to go with GitHub, right? Like that's how you learn GitHub. Then you learn like you have VS Code. But then you would go and let's say you decide to use React. What I would do is I would just read the entire documentation, just like straight, like up and down. But then they'll start mentioning things that like, and this is one reason why it's so hard to learn web development. They'll start mentioning things like Webpack, Babel, npm install, complexity just gets crazy, denser. So what I would do is I would just read all the documentation. And then if then there probably is some sort of like thing that it answers a question I had about how to build a web application inside the documentation. So like one thing is you read the React website, one thing that will pop up is like routing. And then they'll answer, okay, one way to do routing is these different sources. The sources they gave was like React router, and then it was like Next.js, and then it was like Remix. There's a couple of these things. So that's sort of the approach that I took with this. And it's the same thing I did when it came to Ethereum. Like if you just read the entire Ethereum website, like just straight up, like you'll walk away like knowing how all the whole Web3 thing works. So that's some.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to go about it. And I take a very similar approach when I try to learn a new thing. Like I find using like different modalities of learning, using all of them helps me. So like I'll read the documentation, but I also might watch just like an overview video of someone kind of using it and explaining it a little bit differently than the docs. And then the third part is actually doing it and using it. And I think that process works kind of very well for things. So I think that gives me a good idea on kind of like, why you chose this tech stack, how you went about kind of learning these new things that were kind of useful for you when building it. So when you were kind of, considering this application, what was like the very first step you took? Because I feel like a lot of people have like an idea in their head, but they don't necessarily know where to start. It's like, it's just this blank sheet of paper and they don't know where to go. So like, did you come up with a certain design before you kind of dove into the code, or what was kind of your process kind of right at the start when you were wanting to start this project?
Great question. Okay, so with this YouTube clone, if you notice it, if you actually go and check it out, it's a completely like custom-made user interface. So like I literally designed the entire thing beforehand. Then I would dive into the code. So like this is my step process. Like first I would go ahead, wireframe it. I would get, so it's sort of like how UI designers think. Like this is one of the things I learned. You will wireframe the thing, right? You'll get like a storyboard based off of like a whole bunch of different designs that you like for a home page, whole bunch of different designs you would like for a search page, video player page, etc. So you would just get a whole bunch of inspirations. Then I would, second thing was then I went to go buy a design system. So the design system I ended up buying was something called Untitled UI. It's actually a really good design system. And I like them because, and I like buying design systems, especially if you're like a developer, because there's baked in UI principles that is inside the design system that you might not be familiar with. So like, I'll give you an example. The Tailwind team has a huge book on how to build or design user interfaces called Refactoring UI. And like, there's tons and tons of different principles on how to actually build a modern user interface that you just would not think about. Like seriously, the color, one web page might have like 20 different colors or even 30 different colors on it. So that's why I actually like a good try to pick up a good design system. Then I would go ahead and build each one. Like I'll build the home page and then the mobile version of it, then the search page, the mobile version of it, etc. I'll do that. Then it's time to think about like the tech stack. Then I will figure out what tech stack and what infrastructure I would use for it. So in this case, Cloudinary, Vercel, figuring out what those are. And then that's when I start coding things. I would deploy them. To begin with. So deploy to Vercel, deploy to GitHub, etc. And then I would go ahead and start building out the components, the pages and all that. So that's like a high level view.
When it comes time to kind of build the actual pages and stuff like that, is your approach that you like maybe first build out the UI first and then you might add the functionality later? Or how do you kind of go about building those components? Like say you want a login page. Do you build out the UI of the page first and then get kind of all those components in place? And then you kind of add the kind of logic to add a next auth or, making requests to the database afterwards? Or what's kind of your approach there when it comes to building out your actual UI? Great
question. Okay, so let's start with, there's a couple things here. So let's start with, the first thing I would do would be, like I said, deploy them all to the different infrastructures that I'm using. Second thing I would do is if I needed, I usually would have some sort of data that I would deploy. So seed data that I would actually deploy to PlanetScale or MySQL, whatever infrastructure I'm using. So I would deploy them. Then there's a really really cool concept that I've heard in design called atomic design, right? The idea that you have atoms, molecules, organisms, templates, and pages. So you could sort of think of like your atoms, sort of like your colors, fonts, spacing, typography, logos, etc. So because Tailwind allows you to configure a lot of this stuff at the beginning with, I would start with that. Then it's time to build the atoms. I would start building things such as like the buttons, the inputs, the drop downs, the check boxes, etc. Then that's the next step. Then I might start building the organisms such as like the nav bar, the sidebar, the layout, banners, any of that next. And then I would slowly start building out the pages. So then I would build, the home page and the search page and stuff like that. So this is sort of like the approach that I take with it. I will configure authentication at the beginning before I even start anything, right? Like you need to configure authentication first. So yeah, this is sort of the way I approach this. And is it the best way? Not sure, but it's the way I'm doing it right now. So
and I think there is no like what best way. I think a lot of people have different methods of doing it, and like whatever makes sense for you and whatever you can be like consistent with is probably what's going to be best. And I think there's also a book called like Atomic Design that I've read, and I think it is the very same principles that you discussed. And I definitely think that is a good read. So kind of with that, I think that we've covered your approach to kind of designing things, to setting things up and all that stuff. But now let's transition it into maybe, were there any particular like big challenges that you ran into when building this application to where like you bumped up into it and you're like, wow, I just really don't know how to kind of solve this right now? And how did you what was your process of okay, we have this problem, now we need to go kind of solve it? So does anything come to mind for big challenges that you faced?
Great question. Okay, so I'm gonna give you, your audience is pretty familiar with like Prisma and like TypeScript for the most part.
Yep. I would say my audience is mostly Next.js, React, TypeScript, and they've likely used some sort of ORM like Prisma or something like that. So they should be familiar.
Okay. So I'm gonna give you a technical issue that I ran into that might have stopped me or slowed me down like 2 weeks. It was more of a TypeScript error. I'm gonna try to go slow with this, so to make sure that everybody kind of understands it. Okay, so let's just say we're on our front end and we want to get data from our database. So we wanna call an API. Okay, we call it, then we are using Prisma in order to actually get the data. So we're saying maybe Prisma.videos.find many. So we're trying to get as many videos as you want. Okay, one issue. Then I might use include. So I might be getting videos, but I also want to include maybe users and then a comment section as well. So instead of like using Prisma to call the database 4 times, I might just use an include. Okay. Now, when I return the videos, the entire object has now the user and the comment section inside of it. If you want to pass anything down as props for your components, you would have to define it based off of what you called it in our Prisma include. For reusability, that doesn't work. If you're trying to query many different serverless functions, that does not work. Just this huge problem of like trying to figure that out. Yeah, I know there was a lot there, but I want to hear what you have to think about it and say about it.
Absolutely. And when you kind of ran into this issue, this kind of mismatch of what you're trying to do and what was actually going to be like practical and usable over the long term, what did you kind of decide, or what was your process in going to solve this? Was it, just kind of searching around on it on Google, or how did you end up overcoming this kind of challenge that you were facing?
Design patterns are there for a reason. Like, I've like heard of the Gang of Four, right? Like I've read Refactoring Guru. Maybe I should use these things. But I think that the other problem, I think it really comes down to just that you have to have experience using TypeScript in order to actually know that this would actually be a problem. And that's that at a high level.
Were there any mistakes that you made or anything that you kind of had to backtrack and go solve? Is this kind of one of those problems that is one of those mistakes that you potentially made, or do any mistakes come to mind that maybe you can help someone listening to this not run into those same mistakes when building their own applications?
Yeah. So like I said, it's the design pattern problem, right? Like the amount of times I had to rewrite the backend because like, I'll give you an example. Like I said, I read the Gang of Four, right? Like when I was learning how programming and stuff works, like I for whatever reason, I didn't think of like using any design patterns to build the backend at the time, and it caused so much hell. It's ridiculous. So I recommend anybody who's actually trying to build one of these applications is to really think about the architecture and the design patterns before you actually start this stuff. And some things are not self-evident when you start building these until you get like halfway down the line. But still, there are design patterns for a reason. So that's what I'll say.
And it can be really difficult, like when reading some of these books on design patterns, if you don't have any experience actually like implementing things and working with things, it can be too abstract to kind of grasp some of the concepts in those design pattern books, to where you almost have to have the experience that you had of kind of running into these issues of potentially like your design patterns and why maybe the ones that you just kind of intuitively used maybe aren't kind of the best route to go. And you kind of have to come back and be like, okay, this actually really applies to this concept I read in this book on design patterns, and you kind of have to go back and rework it there. So I think a lot of it is just kind of butting your head into stuff and kind of having to make those mistakes and learn from them and kind of keep moving forward from there. So, any beginners listening to this that run into those issues, or they read something on design patterns and it doesn't make sense, a lot of it does come down to just needing to gain more experience with it and to run into those issues yourself, solving them, and then kind of retroactively seeing how design patterns apply to it. So yeah, I think that's a very common thing to run into. And moving forward here, were there any particular, like a lot of my audience does focus on like Next.js and React. Was there anything specific to Next.js or React that you had like a hard time with, or any kind of challenges or difficult parts of Next.js that you faced when trying to learn it or trying to use it, kind of, and applying that in your real world application here?
For people who have been in the industry for a long period of time, I don't know if it's self-evident how hard it is to actually understand how hard building full stack web applications are for beginners. Like I told you about the little model to begin with. Trying to understand how all of these technologies fit together is unbelievably challenging. So we talked about this earlier, like you might learn HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and you might learn GitHub and then VS Code. And then you say you want to learn React. Okay, so do you learn React? Do you read the docs, but they'll start talking about npm install and Webpack and Babel and all this stuff. Then you have to learn what is all that stuff. And then you start learning at a framework as like Next.js. And then we're starting to talk about environment variables, middleware, serverless functions. We're no longer using JavaScript, we're using TypeScript. Then they'll talk about, instead of using CSS, we should use something else like TypeScript CSS. Then they're starting to talk about, you need something like an object relational model in order to put the stuff in a database. So then you're starting to talk about in Prisma. And we're not even talking about like authentication or storing passwords yet. And we didn't even start talking about infrastructure. Like, do I deploy the thing at AWS, or do I deploy the thing on Planet Scale or Vercel or Superbase? Like, it's really hard. So just trying to figure out how all of these things fit together, that's the hardest part for me. So yeah.
And I would say to this day, that is still the hardest part for me. Like at this point in my career, I've got a good grasp on like the React stuff, Next.js stuff, the JavaScript, the CSS, HTML, all that stuff is pretty straightforward. But when it comes to architecting a full stack app, and in my professional job, like we use Kubernetes and we have Docker and we have like all these different things. We use AWS and we have serverless functions and Lambdas and all this stuff. And it's just like, this is a lot. And like on one hand, it's really hard to learn. It can be overwhelming. But on the other hand, I think that, when I first started, it was like just starting with like, just learning HTML at the start can be difficult to wrap your head around. And it can seem like you might hear someone like is a full stack developer and you might feel like you could never get there. But I think that give yourself years of experience, and a lot of this stuff, it just kind of starts piecing together, and you learn one thing and then you could grasp an understanding of something else. And it does start to make more and more sense. And I think that, a big question that people have these days is like, is AI going to take developers' jobs, and like, how is everything working with that? And it's like, even if AI could write perfectly quality code, and AI is getting pretty decent at writing code these days and stuff like that, well, I think the biggest value add a developer can have is like bringing all these pieces together of understanding the full stack architecture, like Kubernetes and Docker, and deploying and using Prisma, and like what tool to use and when to use it and all that stuff. So on one hand, I'm definitely with you. It is definitely difficult. On the other hand, that difficulty is what is going to give us some job security there. So yeah, absolutely. So like maybe it's just one kind of like final summary question here. Is there any kind of, final advice or anything that you can give to a listener? Maybe they're also new to Next.js, or, maybe they want to also break into the industry and, build an application like this. Any just final general advice for those listening to this?
So we talked a little bit about like the way that you kind of like learn how to like read the documentation and things of that nature. I think that's actually quite important. So I think it's very important to get like a first person perspective on this stuff and also a third person perspective on this. So first person would be like the subjective experience of like actually building the web application. So like going in there, coding the thing, designing the thing, etc. That's quite important. But it's also kind of really important to actually read the documentation, actually figuring out how this stuff works and actually looking at tutorials on how this stuff works. You can't, I don't think that you can, personally for me, when I was learning this stuff, you couldn't separate the two, right? Like I could spend all day sitting and reading documentation, but it doesn't actually teach me how to actually code the thing itself. If I sit there and try to code the stuff, and this happened when I was in high school, when I try to code the thing myself without actually reading any of the documentation, you run into like huge problems of just not being able to design the thing right or build the thing properly, et cetera. So both are actually very important. And I also think trying to oscillate between the low level thing that you're doing. So let's just say you're reading the React documentation and then seeing how that fits into the bigger picture of a big full stack web application, right? Because React is just a small part of the entire web full stack application itself. And this is one of the reasons why I ended up learning, I spun like a month learning design and stuff of this nature. So I read the Figma, took a Figma course. I looked at refactoring UI and all this other stuff. Just trying to see how this design and React and Next and all that stuff just fits into how to build these things. So that's my final thought.
Awesome. Well, I think that's great advice. And, I think you also shared a lot of really good advice just with your practical experience so far throughout this entire discussion. So, Jerome, thank you so much for coming on. Is there anywhere that people can go to kind of find you online? Is there elsewhere that you post any content or anywhere else that they could kind of go there?
Great question. So I have a YouTube channel called Code with Jerome. Maybe we can link that in the show notes.
Absolutely.
On there, I have the I might be building. I have some other applications that I might be building for people to check out. So
yeah,
we'll see. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on today. I really enjoyed it.
Definitely. You too, brother. Good to see you.